All right, we're going to start by talking about critical analysis, simply because we're starting to work on our critiques, and I want to give us a little bit of context and some help as we start to do that so we can have more effective critiques. First of all, there are two primary critique categories, objective and subjective. When you're dealing with an objective critique, it's fact-based, meaning that you're usually referring to the formal elements of the composition. So you can say something like the piece has strong contrast. That's irrefutable. Anyone who looks at it will be like, yep, strong contrast, or vibrant color. Yep, vibrant color. So objective critiques, and those are very basic comments on the elements. But an objective critique is focused on the actual, like commenting on the actual visual effects that are happening and not giving any opinions. Now, subjective critique starts to go into that gray area of interpretation and opinion. So, expressive critiques can be something where you're interpreting the piece. You're like, well, this says to me, or I really see this. You can start like identifying what it means to you or what you think the artist is expressing. It can also be contextual. Contextual refers to a couple of things. You can look at the piece in terms of its context of like when it was made, what was the time period, what was happening, how is that a reflection of the culture and the society. You can also look at it as a reflection and the context of the artists themselves. What was that artist dealing with in his or her life? What were some of the events? What was their time period? So a lot of those things can go into that, and those are gray areas. Those are subjective. Those are not necessarily definable aspects. So something to kind of keep in mind. Now, there's not necessarily a right or wrong here. I encourage both objective and subjective critique comments. I just want you to understand and be clear. What typically happens is when students are just starting out, they present objective statements in a subjective way. And the way that they do this is, I like this piece, it has good contrast. Well, if we start out with I like, or I think, or, anything that's an I statement or a me statement in any way, it frames it as being subjective. But in reality, you followed it up with something formal. So the cool thing about doing this in a written format is you can read what you wrote. And if you are reading it and it says like, I like this, or I like the way you did this, or something that starts with an I statement and then it follows it up with something formal, just delete the you like it part. You can put that you like it, but do that as the last thing. Start with something objective. Now you don't always have to. You can start with something subjective. I just want you to be clear as to whether it is objective or subjective. The other thing that I always like to say is that don't be afraid to ask people and call them out on their comments, and just to feel into if it is subjective. If they feel something is working or not working and you can't quite tell what they're basing that on, ask more questions. Um, I realized that probably one of the most crushing critiques I ever got that caused like wild emotions for me was actually a subjective comment. And when I had time to reflect and think about it, I was like, that didn't actually say anything. That was all opinion. And so then I went back, and it was a teacher that made the comment. I went back to the teacher and I was like, please expand because this was not enough information. And so then they were able to like go back and talk about things that would actually help me move on as opposed to just be an opinion. So just kind of get to understand that distinction between what's a personal opinion and what might be a direct comment based on observation of the work. All right, then we have some specific critique techniques. There's 3 of these. A descriptive critique is a great place to start when you don't know where to start. And you're basically describing what you're seeing. You could say, like, this is a still life of, a vase and some flowers, and then, that's done in graphite. And so you can start that way. So if you're really stuck with, like, how to start critique and you don't know what to say at all, start by just describing it. In the process of describing it, something is going to capture your attention and make you want to talk about it more. So it's a great place to start. And then we have cause and effect critique. This is actually more of a tool, I think, for problem solving. And it's, if you could say this piece doesn't have strong balance, well, That's the problem. That's the effect. What is the cause? Why doesn't it have good balance? So then if we can go back into the piece and identify, okay, well, these two shapes are very large on this side and there's nothing on this side. There's a lot of negative space and that's what makes it feel imbalanced. So that would be a cause and effect. And so it's easy to identify a problem, but it's not always easy to identify what's causing the problem. Once we identify what's causing the problem, we can usually fix the problem. So that's a really great skill to start to cultivate. And last is compare and contrast, which I'm sure you've probably done before, especially if you've ever taken an art appreciation or history class, you've done compare and contrast. You're looking at elements of a lot of different things. Now, in art critiques, you can compare and contrast as you get to know the students in the course and see their work. You compare it to previous work. You compare your work to the students' work, like, oh, I see what you did. I did this. It was different. There's a lot of ways that you can use compare and contrast. So it can be kind of fun to do that. You can compare and contrast other students' work to each other. So it's a great technique to use and it works really well to highlight a specific thing, saying like, oh, look what you did here, and here's somebody who did it different and how that works. Or here's somebody who did it similar and look at how, the effects of that. So it's a really great technique. So these are some things that you can keep in mind as we start to enter the critiques and work on the critiques. All right, awesome. All right, now next, we're going to be talking about Gestalt psychology. Now, this is a fun concept. It's a little in depth. We're going to be focusing on the visual components of it. So Gestalt is a German word meaning wholeness or oneness. And yes, it's a psychology. And some people are like, why are we studying a psychology in design class? Well, it's this aspect of the psychology is how humans, and this is outside of any cultural purview, but how human beings process visual information. That's pretty important information. And knowing that, a designer and an artist can use some of those techniques intentionally to really help illustrate their messages. And so it's something that, as artists, as viewers, we use to see, and we start to identify that in ourselves. But as creators, we can understand these things and use these techniques to build our visual imagery so they clearly communicate what we want them to. So they become tools that way. So some of the basic subcategories here are grouping, containment and alignment, repetition, continuity, proximity, and closure. And we'll look at all of these individually. All right, so this is an example of grouping. A lot of Gestalt is, in one way or another, a type of grouping. What this means is when we approach a visual piece, we see the whole piece. That's why we use Gestalt as like that term of wholeness or oneness. So we see the entirety of the image, and then what our brain does is identifies things that are similar, groups it together, puts it over here, and looks at the rest. So if I'm looking at this image, it's a non-objective painting. The first thing that my eyes probably see are all the red shapes. And so what our brains do, keeping in mind this happens in fractions of a second, and I'm going to talk this out, and you're going to be like, I don't do that, but it actually happens very quickly. Anyways, your brain is going to see all the red shapes, and that's going to say, okay, red shapes over here, what's left? I see blue shapes over here, what's left? Yellow and white shapes over here, what's left? Background over here, okay, that's everything. I've seen everything. And then your brain might look at some of those groups and start to identify what they are and say, oh, they're all kinds of different shapes, but these are different colors. And then you might look at it and process it in a different way. But that's the way we visually process. Now, an example I often use in the classroom, and I know we're not in the classroom, but you can visualize the classroom, is if we were in the classroom and we have the art tables and we have people in chairs, right? So if I'm looking across the classroom, what I might do is I might group desks and then people and then the space. And that's like those three groups comprise like help me see everything. Now, does that give me details? No, that's just basic information. And so at a quick glance, this is happening at a fraction of a second, and it helps tell my brain, okay, we have a classroom and it has people in it. Done. That's what grouping does. All right, so, and that's naturally happening when we look at stuff. Okay, containment and alignment. This is interesting, and I'll give you a couple of examples. And I use this piece just because it has some really strong shapes. But containment and alignment creates kind of aligned areas, and we tend to group things by boundaries, visual boundaries in a composition. So in this piece, if we like, first we see this diagonal that's cutting it in half this way. We may tend to group things on above the line and below the line. And so that is a division, and we group that way because there's that strong division. Also, we have this kind of curve rainbow shape. You might kind of review everything like inside the bubble and outside the bubble. So that could be a way that you could create this. We tend to group things that have some kind of containment or alignment to it. And this is, designers use this all the time. Think about websites, drop-down boxes of information. You know, we have a drop-down box, and all of the text or the subcategories within that we know go together because they're aligned and they're in a box. So, and we're like, well, duh, but visually it works. And so what you're doing is you're visually grouping conceptual information to make it easier for the viewer to understand and communicate your idea. And you can do this in a very literal way, like the drop-down boxes on websites, or a more conceptual way in an art piece like this, and relating different pieces to different parts. But containment and or alignment, that's what we're talking about. There's some type of division and or subcategories created by the shapes and lines in the piece that kind of help us see it differently. All right, repetition is pretty straightforward. I picked this piece by Chihuly specifically for a couple of reasons. If we look at just the sculpture in the center, this is a blown glass, predominantly using warm colors. So we're using like the reds, the oranges, and the yellows. But if you look close, there's some greens and blues as well. But the repetition, and because it's hand-blown glass, none of these two tubes are exactly the same. They're all individually different. So repetition, and we'll talk more about repetition later, but it doesn't always have to be a literal stamp of something. Sometimes it can just be something that is very similar. Now, if I look at the whole photograph as an entity, I would say that this kind of red mass in like warm color mass in the center would be repetition, and then the green and the rest of it becomes a repetition. And I start to see that. And then I group it in those two ways. And so I'm still kind of, remember I said that there's still a lot of grouping, but when things are very similar and I read them as going together. Now, the cool thing about repetition is I have them kind of visually masked in this example, but if I have a picture with polka dots that's spread across the whole composition, we can see that the polka dots are repeated, and I would still group them visually together. So repetition, when things are the same, we identify those as being the same. All right, continuity is interesting. This one is probably the least like the rest of them that we've done so far. Continuity has to do with how our eye moves through the piece. So this is a piece by Henry Moore, and typically either people start at the head, because it's a stylized figure, and kind of move their way along the body, or they might start at the foot and they move this way. But because of the linear quality of the piece, our eye moves through the piece in a very deliberate and specific way. And so in a way, the artist is controlling how we view it. And that can be really powerful. And again, using an example from design, if you think of like page layout, and it can be on a website or like a magazine, but if you play with the hierarchy, you know, like the title is the biggest, the subhead is the next, and then we have like the body copy, that's telling us where to start and where to go. So all of those things become really important in communicating how we're supposed to read, if you will, the piece. So continuity can be a very linear format like this, where we actually would follow a line. It could have like implied lines, actual lines, but there is kind of a path that our eye follows when we're looking at the piece. Some pieces have this, some pieces don't, but it's something to look for. Proximity. Proximity is probably one of my favorite just because it's so Simple and so literal. This is a piece by Edward Hopper called Nighthawks. I just love this painting. I don't know why, it's just, there's something about it that's just really cool. But the concept of proximity is the closer two objects are physically, the more we link them conceptually. So in this example, if we look in the little picture of the diner, we see this couple right here, this man and this woman sitting next to each other. Now, they're not talking to each other or looking at each other at the moment, but because of how close they're sitting next to one another in a basically empty cafe, we assume that they either know each other or want to know each other. There is some implied closeness based on where they're sitting. And then conversely, this guy sitting by himself over here, he doesn't know anybody. He just came in for a cup of coffee, slice of pie, I don't know, but he doesn't know anyone. So we automatically make those assumptions. And I use an example with people, but it doesn't always have to be people. It can be even just basic shapes. I can have two floating circles. And if two circles are really close, and then I have this other circle over here that's separate, I'm going to think that there's something relating to these two circles over here, and then this one is separate. So this is just something we naturally do. And so if you want to combine ideas or create a connection, you want to move things physically closer within the composition. However, conversely, if you want to create a separation, having them further away in the composition can be really important. So an example of this is actually a student example from one of my advanced graphic design classes. We do an awareness poster of something that's ugly, because a lot of graphic design is making things aesthetically pleasing. So how do you create a strong design of something ugly? Anyways, and then it has to be supported by a brand, and so they have to integrate a logo and things like that. So this particular student chose like the waste crisis. As you can see, it was like bringing the awareness, and it's all hypothetical, right? So, and it's bringing the awareness by Pepsi. Now, they wouldn't allow me to share their first version, and that's fine because I can just tell you. Their first variation of this, when they brought it to critique originally, had the Pepsi logo right here under waste crisis. And everyone in the class was like, that's weird, because what we start to do is we identify that, we start to make Pepsi feel like it's trash. Like it becomes the waste crisis. And they were like, obviously that's not what it's like. No, that's how it reads. And so what I told them, they were like, well, how do we fix this? And I'm like, it's going to sound silly, but you have to physically remove them from one another. And so when they took the logo and they put it at the opposite corner, it now feels like what it's supposed to be is an awareness poster sponsored by somebody, not a commentary on a brand. So again, it's crazy how effective that is. But that is. So, and then kind of going back to some of the forms we talked about, like if it's a close edge, is it touching, overlapping, or combining? The closer it is, the more we link it. So just kind of being aware of those not only physical, but conceptual connections is really important. All right, closure. This is the last aspect of Gestalt we're going to be focusing on, and it's probably the most conceptual. So closure is fascinating. What it refers to is especially with things that are non-objective, but when something is non-objective and we can't identify it, our brain, computers are modeled after the human brain, right? So our brain likes to solve puzzles. Our brain is not satisfied with, I don't know. It wants to know the answer. And so if we look at this picture, it's not objective and it's like splashes of paint. It's not anything identifiable. So as you look at this, and as we look at this, we're going to see a couple of things. Like your brain is going to be like, okay, I can't see anything. It's going to, first off, it's seeing the repetition between the two objects. It's separating them based on the colors. So it's already doing some of those other things we've talked about. But then with closure, it needs to define it. So I don't know what you guys see. You can take a moment and say, like, do you see something in this? Personally, what I see are like fishtails. So I see like kind of two fishtails, like maybe they're jumping or diving or something. And is that what it is? No, it's just a non-objective design. But my brain's like, oh, that's what it is. Okay, moving on. And so our brain wants to identify something, which is often why, and especially, so more creative people are more comfortable leaving something a little bit more open-ended. Like it can be, we can interpret it as being non-objective, but somebody who's more literal minded, is going to need a definition, which is often why we kind of get that, someone who might look at something and be like, okay, this is definitely this. And so that's part of it. So let me also show you. Okay, so one thing I want to mention about closure, for artists and designers, it's not really so much about what you see in the piece. It's more about the concern of what other people might see in your work and being aware of what those things might be. A great example would be the bean. So I just took this from Chicago's website. Obviously, I just screenshot their website, but I don't know how many people have ever seen this sculpture before. People call it the bean. It's in Chicago in Millennium Park. It's really cool to see in person, actually, but it's highly reflective metal, and it kind of creates this funhouse mirror effect when you see it. It's obviously very large. Now, when the artist Anish Kapoor created this, and so when Millennium Park, it went up in 2000, and people were like driving and walking by, and they're like, "What the heck is that?" And then they were like, "Looks like a bean." And so people started calling it the bean. Now, Anish Kapoor, the artist who did this, was not super happy about this idea of the bean. He actually wrote this rant to the Chicago Tribune about, this is the cloud gate, and this is what it means, and like he talked about the conceptual intent, which as an artist I totally get. It's like, well, I was trying to communicate this. But what you have to understand is that a viewer's interpretation of something is just as valid. And so I'm not saying that he should have redesigned the shape or anything so it didn't look like a bean. I'm just saying that he needed to be aware that that could be an interpretation. I find that having kind of, my non-artistic family and friends are a great place to kind of show things, and like that's where I'll get those beans, if you will, that'll come out and they're like, "Is that a bean?" And it's like, "No, it's not, but thank you for that." So if I didn't want it to look like a bean, it won't, because I'll change it. But if I don't care, then that's fine. So, and just as an aside, I guess 10 years later they re-interviewed him and asked him, if he was still upset that everyone in the world calls it the bean, and his response was, "Everyone in the world knows it, so I don't care what they call it." So he got over the bean problem. So, but the actual title of this is Cloudgate, but everybody sees a bean. So that's what we're talking about with closure. When we can't identify it, we see something else. We project what our images are, our interpretations are. So you have to, as the artist, decide how clear do you want to be in terms of communicating your message. All right, now, I wanted to briefly introduce the design principles as a concept. We're going to be going through them individually. Like I said, some different units will be about different things. We're going to be focusing on balance today, but I wanted you to just see them collectively, but I'll go over them later. But the design principles include balance, contrast, economy, emphasis, gradation, harmony, movement, proportion, repetition, rhythm, unity, and variety. So like I said, today we're going to be focusing on balance. There are two subcomponents of balance, formal balance and informal balance. Formal balance includes symmetrical balance, approximate symmetry, radial balance, and informal balance includes asymmetrical balance, which is the dominant form, and then imbalance, which in the learning stage, I'd like people to avoid because it can be used intentionally, but typically at this level, it's used unintentionally. But I still want you to know what it is. So let's look at examples. All right. The three levels of formal balance. Formal balance refers to the fact that there's either a line or point of symmetry. So symmetrical balance, these two examples on the left have a vertical axis. Now, it doesn't have to be vertical. It could be horizontal. It could be diagonal, any which way. But there will be a line of axis, and it's a mirror image on both sides. And we can see that very clearly on both of these images on the left-hand side. Now, if we go to the right-hand side, we can see approximate symmetry. Approximate symmetry is just what it sounds like. It's almost symmetrical, but not quite. There is still a line of symmetry, and so we can still break it in half, but it's not exact on both sides. So if we look at the leaf on the top, obviously, if we look at just the shapes, we see a very specific, the shapes are the same, but the way they did the colors and values changed the visual weight. So it's approximately symmetrical. We see that symmetry, but it's not like perfect symmetry. And below that, the fact that all these boxes are facing the same way instead of kind of mirrored makes that approximately symmetrical. So it's the same amount of space, but it's a little bit different. Then we have radial balance. Before we go to radial balance, in approximate symmetry, if you think about nature tends to be a little bit more approximately symmetrical than perfectly symmetrical. If you think about like the human body is a great example. We have two of a lot of things, but in a lot of cases, they're not actually the same size. Compare your hands, compare your feet, anything that you've got if you've ever like taken a photograph of you or somebody else and then like cut off like half the face and replicated the other side, that looks so strange. So in fact, if you want something to feel more natural, approximate symmetry feels more natural. Perfect symmetrical balance feels very contrived. It doesn't feel natural. It feels very man-made. So that's just a distinction as you decide what type of balance you want to use, something to think about. Anyways, radial balance has a central point. Now, two examples of radial balance. Like this is actually symmetrical balance as well. So as I was saying, radial balance has a central point. This top example is also symmetrical. It actually has, you can see, a vertical, horizontal, and diagonal lines of symmetry as well. When a piece has both symmetrical balance and radial balance, we still would first classify it as being radial because that point is so dominant. But you can also have radial balance that is not symmetrical. The example below here shows that the point is off center. I can't draw a line of symmetry anywhere in this, but clearly everything is coming out of that central point. So that is another example of radial balance. You can have radial in multiple ways as long as it kind of feels like it's coming out of one point. So all of these are types of formal balance. Like I said, it has either a line of symmetry or a point of symmetry. So a couple other examples. This is a Native American rug that is symmetrical. And the interesting thing here, it has some vertical and horizontal lines of symmetry that you can play with. Approximate symmetry, the two Fridas. This is a great example. I mean, it's the same person. These are two self-portraits of herself, different variations of herself, but obviously they're a little bit different. There's two of them. They're dressed different, so that's a great example of approximate symmetry. Radial symmetry, kind of showing like this Islamic mosaic on the left-hand side, like that perfect symmetry in terms of radial symmetry and like the precision of that versus like a flower, which is coming out of a central point, but has different weights and balances, even though there is undeniably that central point there. All right. Now let's look at informal balance. Informal balance has two subcategories, imbalance and asymmetrical balance. So quickly, we're going to talk about imbalance. If you look at the diagram on the lower left, you can see that's a great example. It's like, that's just not balanced. We feel like the red should be really heavy and weigh that down because visually it is. Imbalance is interesting. It usually means that there's a disproportionate amount of negative space left in the composition in some way. So there's this weird open space and then a lot of other things happening in a different area, so it doesn't feel refined. Imbalance makes the viewer feel uncomfortable because it feels like the piece isn't complete. Sometimes if you're communicating a concept that is intending to make the viewer feel uncomfortable, using like pushing your balance to getting close to imbalance can be helpful. It's just true imbalance often feels unresolved and unintentional. So kind of writing that line and making it work for you as opposed to against you can be really challenging. The example of the wheel on the top of that is just one of those stock photos that is allowing you space to put your own stuff over there. There's a lot of things out there right now, but just on its own, it feels imbalanced. Not that I need to center the wheel per se, but it just feels like, why is it arranged in that particular segment? So, and then asymmetrical. Now, we are talking about this last, but I don't want you to place the importance on this last. About 80% of all artwork is asymmetrical. It is the most common type of balance found in art. And it's not as easy to identify. I mean, like, there's not just a line or a point of symmetry, but it means that there's a variety of different shapes, but it feels complete. It feels done. It feels balanced. So both of these here are student examples where we have a lot of different objects kind of in the composition. However, it doesn't feel like one side is heavier than the other. It doesn't feel like there's a big space or a gap. There's a lot of things going on, but it feels kind of complete or right. And there's not a line of symmetry or a point of symmetry. So that's a great example. Those are great examples of asymmetrical. Now let's look at a real life one. This is something that I'm sure you know and have seen before. Starry Night is a wonderful example of asymmetrical balance because we have the cypress tree on this side and the moon over here, and I can't draw a line of symmetry any which way. It's not a point, but they balance each other out. And it, the sky versus the city, I mean, it feels so resolved. And then even looking at nuances like this darker area over the hills over here, right under the moon, like if that wasn't so dark, the side with the cypress tree would feel a little bit heavier. So, I mean, it's a very sophisticated composition, but it feels complete. So that sensation of feeling complete tells us it is balanced. And like I said, this is just a great example of asymmetrical balance. So if that helps, most pieces that you see will probably be asymmetrical, although just because I just taught you this, at first, this one's going to seem like the hardest one, just because it's not as precise as some of the others. All right, so that takes us to the end of Unit 2. Check out the video that talks about the project, and I'll see you in the next unit. Thanks.